gezellig. Ja. Zo 2 promotoren zijn. Dan krijgen ze hun. Dan kun je mee controleren. Oh, dankjewel.
Thank you.
I hereby open the meeting. Candidate Akassoy, I bid you welcome. You're appearing before a committee appointed by the doctorate board of Erasmus University Rotterdam to defend your thesis and the appended propositions. Before we start the discussion, I invite you to give a short introduction in which you tell us about the subject and the aims of your study and your findings. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Honorable Rector, esteemed committee members, family, friends, and colleagues, welcome and thank you for joining me today. Over the next 15 minutes, I'm excited to share with you an overview of the research that underpins the thesis titled Beyond Headache, an Epidemiological Approach to Vascular Correlates of Migraine in the Elderly. Imagine a thunderstorm in your brain disrupting everything. It's a pounding, one-sided headache that often comes with nausea and vomiting. Even simple movements, like walking across the room, can make it feel worse. Sound and light become unbearable. The only relief? Silence, darkness, and rest. Now imagine trying to live your life while feeling like this, sometimes for up to 3 days. On top of this, around 1 in every 3 migraine patients also experience temporary neurological symptoms, also called auras, such as zigzag lines in the vision, or trouble finding words and forming sentences, or tingling in the hands, or numbness that affects usually on one side of the body. Migraine affects 2 to 3 times as many women as men. For students, it can derail exams, assignments, and concentration. For employees, frequent migraine can mean missed deadlines, reduced productivity, and the fear of being seen as unreliable. People with migraine often have to cancel plans and miss events due to attacks. It's not just the pain, you see, it is the loss of connection and the constant worry about when the next attack will strike. Migraine affects approximately 1 in 10 people worldwide. Each year, millions visit emergency rooms when their migraines become unbearable, adding strain to the healthcare systems and financial stress on families. You may ask then, so why do we have migraines? Why migraines happen? The truth is, we don't know yet have a complete answer. Migraine doesn't have one single cause. Instead, it is thought to be a result of a mix of factors involving our nerves, brain, and blood vessels. First, we have the trigeminal system, which is a pathway connecting the blood vessels in the brain to the pain centers. When neurons in this system are triggered, they send pain signals and can lead to the symptoms we feel during a migraine. Next, we think genetics play a role, because migraine is often run in families and this is highly heritable. And some migraines, particularly those with aura, involve a process called cortical spreading depolarization, which is like a wave of electrical activity spreading through the brain. This can explain the visual disturbances that I showed you earlier, or other sensations people might notice before the headache starts. Another factor is brainstem and diencephalon activity. Before or during a migraine, parts of the brain, like hypothalamus, become more active. This may explain symptoms like nausea, fatigue, or other symptoms like sensitivity to light and sound. And Another factor is, last factor actually, based on the experimental models of migraine, we think that certain substances in the brain, like calcitonin gene-related peptide, CGRP, contribute to the pain and inflammation by acting on blood vessels. So, what is missing? Well, migraine is considered a neurovascular disorder because it involves both the nervous system and blood vessels. As shown by the effects of some drugs targeting the blood vessels, they are effective, triggers like some vasoactive substances that can provoke attacks, and observed links between migraine and some vascular conditions. However, there are some key gaps remain in the literature. We still don't fully understand how cardiovascular risk factors and migraine are connected. The role of immune system outside the migraine attacks is not that clear. And there are conflicting findings on migraine's link to small vessel disease in the brain. And lastly, the connection between migraine and vascular conditions such as stroke or dementia in older adults is uncertain. So why we focus on elderly, especially? So aging of the blood vessels and the vascular system may uniquely interact with migraine, affecting the long-term health outcomes like stroke and dementia. And if we understand these links, this could improve the prevention and treatment strategies for this aging population, whom they are already a vulnerable population. Therefore, I focused on these gaps, particularly how migraine interacts with the vascular system in older adults. So I started by exploring the vascular correlates of migraine, so investigating its relationship with vascular risk factors and immune system. Next, I turned to the vessels in the brain, specifically cerebral small vessel disease, to see if migraine is associated with changes in the brain. And finally, I examined the clinical consequences of migraine's potential role in increasing the risk of stroke or dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. And to answer these questions, I used data from Rotterdam study, a large population-based research project that began actually 35 years ago. Initially, all people aged over 55 and over who lived in the Ommoord district here in Rotterdam, they were invited to participate in this research. The participants, they visited the research center where they underwent multiple tests, such as, for example, like blood tests, heart films, memory tests, and brain scans. And researchers also visited participants at home to conduct interviews. And in one of those interviews, for example, we asked about their migraine symptoms. Approximately every 5 years, these tests were repeated at the research center to monitor the changes over time. And in addition, what we did, we followed participants for the development of diseases such as stroke or dementia by linking their information with our database, their information in the GP or nursery homes, if they stay in one, to connect them with our database, actually. And since 2000, the study has been expanded to include people who are over 45 and over. And today, it's actually consists over approximately 18,000 participants. So, let's start by what we found with this data. Let's start by examining the migraine's relationship with the peripheral vascular system. First, I investigated the relationship between migraine and some of the traditional cardiovascular risk factors like blood pressure, obesity, cholesterol, smoking, and diabetes. Interestingly, I found that most of these factors were unrelated to migraine, and some of them, like smoking and diabetes, were actually inversely related. However, I observed a weak association with higher diastolic blood pressure, which is the blood pressure, the pressure in the vessels when the heart is resting. And these results suggest that migraine may not be directly connected to common cardiovascular risk factors. Instead, it may be related to other cardiovascular risk factors affecting the vascular system's health. Second, I explored the role of immune system in migraine by analyzing some of the common blood markers of the immune system, such as granulocyte, platelet, and lymphocyte counts. Granulocytes are a type of white blood cells that help fight off infections, while platelets are cells that help blood to clot. And lymphocytes are critical for defending the body against viruses and bacteria. While some studies have shown increased immune activity during acute migraine attacks when people admitted to emergency rooms in hospitals, we found no evidence of differences in immune system markers between people with and without migraine, but outside the attacks, not during. And this suggests that immune activation might be temporary during migraine attacks rather than a constant feature of it. And this led me to check if migraine is related to vascular health, specifically in the brain, rather than in the periphery. To explore this, I investigated the relationship between migraine and changes in the brain structure using MRI scans. Cerebral small vessel disease actually is an umbrella term for a variety of conditions resulting from damage to small blood vessels in the brain. We specifically looked at markers such as white matter damage, white matter hyperintensities, lacunar infarcts, these are small strokes in the deep brain regions, and microbleeds, these are tiny spots of bleeding in the brain. And lastly, shrinking of the brain volume, which is also known as atrophy. So our findings showed no association between migraine and any of these markers. In other words, despite earlier concerns, migraines do not seem to be related with vascular damage or significant changes in the brain structure, at least in the markers that we checked. And finally, I checked if migraine is related to diseases involving vascular system, such as stroke and dementia. I started by investigating whether migraine increased the risk of stroke, which is the second leading cause of death worldwide. To investigate this, we first identified which participants had migraine and which did not. Then we followed them for almost a decade to see if people with migraine develop strokes more frequently than those without. What did we find? While there was an association between migraine and stroke risk, it was not statistically significant. This means the result could be due to a chance rather than a real connection, but we don't know. And lastly, is another vascular condition that also affects millions of people worldwide, which is dementia, including its most common form, Alzheimer's disease. Much like the previous study, we followed participants over time to see who developed dementia. Surprisingly, we found that people with migraine had a reduced risk of developing dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. Specifically, people with migraine had 30% lower risk of developing dementia at any given time. So, to summarize, let me take you to the key findings of my research. Most cardiovascular disease risk factors are not related or inversely related to migraine, except for slightly higher diastolic blood pressure. Immune system markers like white blood cells and platelets show no difference in people with migraine outside attacks. Migraine does not seem to affect the brain health based on imaging of small vessel disease, and migraine does not seem to increase the risk of stroke in older adults, and people with migraine have a lower risk of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. Thanks to decades of dedicated efforts by researchers and clinicians worldwide, we have already seen significant progress improving the biological, psychological, and social health of people living with migraine. Building on this foundation, with continuing research on the topic, there is a promising outlook for continuing advancement that will further enhance the lives of those affected by this condition. Thank you, and I give word back to Rector.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have a large committee today of experts who are all willing to challenge you and to discuss your thesis. I'll start off with someone you know best of all. That's your promoter, Professor Ikram.
A few moments later.
And with the dementia follow-up with the incident.
Dear candidates, the time allotted for the defense of your thesis is over. The committee will now withdraw to deliberate. Would you please wait here until we return? I adjourn the meeting. I reopen the meeting. Dear candidates, the doctorate board of Erasmus University Rotterdam, represented by me, has considered your thesis, and having heard your defense and the advice of this committee, I grant you the title of doctor. I authorize Professor Ikram to bestow this degree on you in the customary manner.
It is with great pleasure that I undertake the task the Rector Magnificus has allotted me. By the authority invested by law and according to the decision of the doctoral board of this university, I hereby confer upon you, Cevdet Akarsoy, the doctorate degree. Do you promise to continue to perform your duties according to the principles of academic integrity, honestly and with care, critically and transparently, and independently and impartially? As a testimony and proof hereof, I present you the diploma signed by the Rector Magnificus, promoter, co-promoter, and other members of this committee present here, and endorsed with the seal of the university. Having performed this task, may I take the opportunity to be the first to address you as a doctor and congratulate you on this achievement. So, Dr. Akarsoy, dear Cevdet, so many congratulations. I will be brief because your co-promoter will do the laudatio. Thinking back, 5 years back, you started your thesis, and it was just before the pandemic came. I guess it sounds like many years back. But it's been a wonderful trajectory to supervise you, to discuss with you science, but also things outside of science. Your fascination and focus on science communications is something that stood out. But again, congratulations. I'll be brief, and I'll hand over to Dr. Bos to do the laudatio.
Dear Dr. Akarsoy, dear Cevdet, it's my great honor to be actually the second person to congratulate you with this important achievement of obtaining your PhD. Also to your mother and your father and your family watching the live stream from Turkey, I would say, çok tebrikler. My apologies that my knowledge of the Turkish language stops there. Back to you, Cevdet. Looking back at your PhD trajectory, which started beginning 2020, I think it's safe to say that you encountered a couple of hurdles along the way. Some higher than others, but you made it. And that is ultimately what counts and also shows your perseverance, one of your strong traits. Now, I'd like to go back briefly to the first time we met, which was at your job interview together with Kamran in November 2019. I remember very well that when you came into the room, for a second I thought that something went wrong. As the person entering, you looked like someone who came for a job interview to become a pilot, wearing a neat pilot-like jacket and a pin with pilot wings on it. During the course of our conversation, it quickly became clear that the reason for this was your fascination for flight simulators, a topic of which I honestly think that Kamran and you have been talking about close to half of the time for the job interview. Thinking back, I could have known about this passion of yours because in your introduction letter, you wrote, and I cite, "I have a background in aviation. I've been training individuals, teaching classes, and writing about flight simulators for the last 10 years. On top of that, I'm also a psychologist." I think that this was and still is the first motivation letter in which a hobby is much more prominently discussed than a university degree. During the course of your PhD, I've come to know you as very enthusiastic, empathic, and reliable. Also from your colleagues, in the different research groups you worked in, I've never heard a negative word about you. You helped out where you could, and you were always willing to take an extra step to assist others. As I said before, the trajectory itself was not an easy one. As a psychologist by training, you needed to study more on every topic of your thesis than colleagues with a background in medicine. Also, particularly in your first year, you had a tremendous amount of work on data collection and data cleaning on the migraine data in the Rotterdam study, which now, thanks to you, has become a very nice and ready-to-use data set. In addition to this, you also obtained your MSc in health sciences during the first 2 years of your PhD, which I think made you much more confident to talk about epidemiology and epidemiological analytical skills. This amount of work and responsibility in combination with your own private practice in psychology and your very active involvement in science communications, for which you also set up a science communication committee here at Erasmus MC, was almost obviously quite a lot to keep going and led to a difficult period during your PhD. With the three of us, we had to redefine your working flow and focus, and you were able to come back from that even stronger than before and wrote 4 very nice manuscripts as first author, contributed greatly to 1 manuscript as a second author. 2 were published in the renowned Cephalalgia journal and another in neurology, and of note, your paper in migraine and stroke was even accompanied by a very nice editorial by Professor Kurt, in which it was stated how important a good causal framework is. This brings me to your affinity and passion for science communication, which I really appreciated over the years. There are too many examples to mention of how you put this passion into practice, but I particularly like your YouTube sessions in which you discussed a variety of topics with renowned scientists, including the topic of migraine with Professor Maas van der Brink. And another nice example is the infographic in your thesis on the back of your propositions, which maybe not everyone saw yet. So turn around the leaflet, I would say. A most impressive example is the book you wrote, or should I say had written by ChatGPT, on communicating psychological research findings called The AI's Guide to Psychological Well-Being. Before I wrap up, I'd like to highlight one more interesting fact that I learned from your acknowledgement section in your thesis. From your words, it seemed like the supervision styles of Kamran and me seamlessly connected. While Kamran's, and I quote, unique supervision style at times provided more questions than answers, my supervision style, and I quote again, teaching by asking questions at the end making me feel as if I already knew the answers. If I had just known more often the questions of Kamran, we could have answered these in a follow-up session together. I need to close, but not before. I would like to express my gratitude to the committee members here today, Professor Kurt, Professor Kavusi, and Dr. Padma. Thank you very much for your willingness to evaluate the thesis and your presence here today. Professor Ferrari, Professor Maas van der Brink, and Dr. Bischoff, thank you for being here today and for the lively discussion on the topic of migraine, which clearly remains a topic of interest. Jeff, back to you. I'm incredibly proud of what you have achieved, and I'm sure I also speak on behalf of your promoter, Professor Ikram. I would like to congratulate you once again and wish you and your family a fantastic rest of the day. You deserve it. I give the word back to the rector.
Thank you very much. Dr. Akarsoy, I have the pleasure also on behalf of the doctorate board of the university to congratulate you on having obtained your doctorate degree. It is quite an achievement that you have made, and we have a little present from the university for you. It's it's an ornament, the silver top of the staff of the beetle. It's small, but it's very precious. So I would say wear it as often as possible here on your knee, especially when you're abroad at symposia and congresses. And if people ask what it is, say this is from Rotterdam, where I obtained my PhD thesis. And then you think of us, and we will certainly remember you for what you did today. I formally declare this meeting closed.